Guatemala is located in Central America, bordering Mexico, Caribbean, and El Salvador. The Mayans were the indigenous population long before the Spanish even arrived. The fight for justice had begun long ago before the early 20th century. Today we are going to talk about the Guatemalan Civil War. From 1931 to 1944, a dictator called George Yubico ruled the country. He allowed the United Fruit Company to make great profit in Guatemala. On October 19, 1944, his dictatorship was overthrown by the October Revolutionaries, made up of students, military officers, and liberal professionals.
After the overthrow of the oppressive dictator, army officials allowed others to take political power. This began a democratic period which allowed free speech and political power. Many Guatemalans were overjoyed during this time. Many of the reforms aimed to help the indigenous people. Plans for land reforms were also made. In 1953, the government began agrarian reforms. This reform distributed land more equally between Guatemalan farmers and companies. The United Fruit Company, supported by the U.S., was upset. They argued that the land they lost was already used by them. Even when the Guatemalans offered compensation, they refused to let it go.
At this time, the Guatemalans were living a miserable life. There was an unequal distribution of wealth in which 3% of the population controlled over 65% of farmland. An average Guatemalan slept on the ground with 50 people in a room, lacked of running water and electricity. In 1954, the democratically elected president of Guatemala legalized Communist Party and was about to nationalize the plantation of the United Fruit Company. This was considered a communist threat to the United States, especially in this era of the Cold War. As a result, CIA backed a military coup by Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas. The U.S. installed Castillo as the military regime in Guatemala, who reversed reforms that benefited poor farmers, eliminated voting rights for illiterate Guatemalans, and also committed genocide against the indigenous Mayan people.
January 31st, a group of indigenous farmers marched a nonviolent campaign to protest the murders and kidnappings the Guatemalan army committed to their people. They entered the Spanish embassy in Guatemala City. The protests were ignored, and the military answered with the burning down of the building. A total of 36 people were killed, farmers and officials. The burning of the building was known as the Spanish Embassy Fire or the Massacre. This is a turning point in the war because it is another example of how human rights were violated once again. Despite the Spanish ambassador's pleas to stay nonviolent, the Guatemalan government took extreme actions to show how oppressive they were. Human rights violation would be the acts of genocide committed by the Guatemalan army to the indigenous Mayan people. Known as the Silent Holocaust, the government and forced locals targeted over 626 villages. Among them were innocent, defenseless Mayan families. They were forced to watch or take part in the systematic brutal murders. Though guerrilla groups did commit cruel acts, the main human rights violators was Efrain Rios Montt and his followers. They claimed that the Mayan people were hostile communists who were working to coup against the government. The Mayan people were viewed as allies of the guerrillas. However, many of them were neutral in the war.
Before the start of the Civil War, there were 4 left-wing guerrilla groups. They are the Guerrilla Army of the Poor, or EGP, Revolutionary Organization of Armed People, ORPA, Rebel Armed Forces, or FAR, and Guatemalan Labor Party.
Those 4 groups came together to form the Guatemalan National Revolutionary Unity, or the URNG. They wanted more human rights and land. These groups contained mostly of farmers that wanted a change in the oppressive government, and only a few communists were actually in the rebel groups. The majority of the Guatemalan population was the indigenous people. They were the peasants and farmers. As the Spanish moved into their own land, they became the underprivileged. The Mayan people went through many horrible and cruel acts during that time. Children were tortured and raped. Others were lit on fire alive, and the wombs of pregnant women were cut open by soldiers. As peace talks were made, the Historical Clarification Commission, or the CEH, was in charge to justify the genocide. They preserved the memories of the many victims, gave compensation, and promised democracy. They also revealed how the U.S. kept sending aid to Guatemala, knowing that they were just contributing to the bloodbath for their own selfish reasons.
On May 25, 1993, President George Serrano suspended Constitution, dissolved Congress and the Supreme Court. He also restricted civil rights and imposed censorship. However, his action was so unpopular and the pressure of the public forced him to resign and flee the country. The first peace talk between the Guatemalan government and the URNG was unsuccessfully held in Spain in 1987. However, the second one held by the UN in 1993 was quite successful. On June 23, 1994, the Commission for Historical Clarification was established as a peace agreement to clarify past human rights violations and acts of violence. In 1996, the Accord for Firm and Lasting Peace was signed. Over the course of the 30-year-long Civil War, over 200,000 people died or went missing. The war officially ended. But the struggle for justice is still on today. Back to today, on May 10, 2013, General Efrain Reyes Montt, the ex-president of Guatemala, was put on trial. He was charged for committing genocide and crimes against humanity. He was originally sentenced to 80 years imprisonment, but was later over. Reyes-Mont's case was ordered to be reset and will be resumed in 2015. Guatemala is still striving for the better. It has one of the highest crime rates. About 56% of its people is living in poverty. Human rights violations such as child labor and gender-based violence still exist in the country today.